There's no such thing as starting on time after any break, typically. But I hope you all had a chance to take a break here. We have a great lineup this afternoon. So I want to welcome everybody back. It's my pleasure to introduce our afternoon panel to discuss space's role in empowering the Joint All-Domain Command and Control, or JADC2, as it's more commonly referred to in the media. As we all know, the ability to command and control battle space assets in a rapid, coordinated, and precise fashion is an imperative for meeting the challenge of modern warfare. The scale of modern operating environments, think the Western Pacific, concurrency of advanced threats, think the Western Pacific, and limited force projection capabilities, think the Western Pacific, demand U.S. commanders net mission results in the most effective and efficient manner possible. They must also do so while avoiding undue threats to the system. Space-based capabilities, whether discussing sensors or communication networks, are a keystone of this endeavor. With that, I'd like to introduce our panelists for this afternoon. Lieutenant General Phil Grant, to my immediate left here, Deputy Chief of Space Operations, Strategy, Plans, Programs, Requirements, Dishwashing, Bottle washing. Phil is doing the job of typically on most service staffs of at least 2 3-star generals, about 2.5 actually. So Phil, it's great to have you with us here.
Thanks, sir. Good to be here.
Dr. Brad Tousley, Vice President of Strategy and Technology at Raytheon Intelligence and Space. Welcome, Brad. It's good to have you. And Maria Demery, Vice President and General Manager for Special Programs at Lockheed Martin Space in Denver, right? Good to have you with us.
Thank you.
So I'd like to begin with some questions here for the whole panel. And Phil, I'll start with you. We've heard Space Force leadership repeatedly state that the service has a pivotal role in building out the JADC2 capabilities. And this will be one of the most important undertakings of the Guardians going forward to do this. Could you walk us through this to understand exactly what you envision the Space Force to bring to the JADC2 construct?
Sure. There's 2 main functions and then a function that relates to all the services. The 2 primary contributions from Space Force is the persistent regional battlespace awareness, the sensors. And then as we heard from Dr. Ponier at lunch today, SDA's LEO constellation is the JADC2 backbone for data transport in space. The third piece that I wanted to mention, and I wanted to highlight Secretary Kendall, the Secretary of the Air Force, recently named General Luke Cropsey as the PEO for C2BMC. And in that role, he'll at least ensure that the DAF part of JADC2 is completely integrated to deliver all of his operational imperatives, and then work with the other services. Luke's been on the road a lot in the last couple of weeks since being named in that position, most recently out with the Army with Project Convergence. So 3 main pieces: the sensor, the data transport layer that Derek talked about, and then ensuring that our capabilities feed into the overarching JADC2 services.
Got it. So all 3 services are developing their own operational level of war command and control. ABMS is the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy have one. Not sure if the Marine Corps has one as well. I suspect eventually will. So are you going to use ABMS as kind of the straw man to show how it can be integrated and then add the other services, or do you see this as a simultaneous effort?
I think it's going to be a simultaneous effort, and I don't want to speak for Luke, but he's absolutely looking at the best of breed, if you will, and what's working well, what might not be working well. And then to your point, there's strategic, operational, and tactical levels of C2 to make sure that all of those levels integrate to deliver the capability.
Along those lines, resiliency, we've talked a lot about that today. That's got to be an attribute of the architecture for sure. But what other attributes do you think are going to be important for what space will bring to JADC2?
The resiliency is absolutely the most important. We talked about being able to fight through any degradation or defeat of our assets. The proliferated constellation certainly enables that. The other part that we're going to talk about is the overwhelming amount of data, and make sure the operators at each of their levels have access to and the ability to get to the data that's important to them, so they can prosecute their mission and not be overwhelmed by all of the data that the modern CQ systems are going to provide.
Very good. Thank you. Brad, if I could turn to you. Your company's a key technical partner on this JADC2 venture, and we generally know or we can envision how complex this architecture is, a problem to solve is, and how this is going to have to integrate not just with systems coming forward with standards that are established, but backwards compatibility to legacy systems. Can you break that down a little bit? What does a force design look like to yield this? We've heard globally meshed environment. What does that really mean in connectivity and your views on this?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. Within the joint all domain operations JADC2 framework, I think about things in four ways. Number one, time, factor of time. Number two, factor of distance or effects. Number three, the sensing infrastructure necessary. And then the last piece is really the information flow and command and control. Obviously, joint all domain operations, the key term there is all domain, which means the space, air, ground, maritime, and undersea. I think of all those together because the combatant commanders. The way Raytheon is focused right now is two specific areas focused on joint all domain operations and how we can support it. Number one, happy to work for the Department of the Air Force on the ABMS, what's called the Digital Infrastructure Consortium. We're one of 5 members. We're happy to be able to work on that. Those are things like system engineering, the digital fabric, connectivity, and the command and control elements. And we're doing that within a consortium framework to try and provide that. The second piece you mentioned, the fact the other services also have joint all domain operations activities. In the case of the Army, Project Convergence, we're working on a program called Titan, which is the Army's essentially targeting node that could be on the receiving end of all the sensor information from the space and the air that can provide the ability over extremely large ranges to provide the effects necessary.
Very good, thank you. And Maria, over to you. So the transport layer that we heard Derek speak about is obviously going to be crucial, but space is going to be important from a sensor layer as well. What, in your view, what does a robust sensor construct look like that maximizes both performance for the warfighter and resilience in time of conflict?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And thank you also to the Mitchell Institute for hosting this event today. I think this has been a very timely and important conversation that we've been having. So thank you for the opportunity. As you said, the SDA transport layer, which we just got an excellent briefing on in our keynote speech at lunch, is absolutely critical. There's a Mitchell paper out on the table that says satellite comms is the backbone of JADC2, and we would definitely agree with that. You can have the sensors, you can have the effectors, but if you can't get that data to the warfighter, you can't get the effect that you want on the timelines that we're looking to get them by with JADC2. So to your point about vantage points for sensors, the reason we want to go to space, we've talked about this several times today, but it's so compelling. The ability to have that broad and persistent view of the area or region that we're interested in, the ability to get to access denied areas, the ability to provide communications between warfighters and decision makers that might be in vastly different places, and the ability to get the data to them so that they can get the effect that they're looking for. So to your question on considerations about, balancing performance with resiliency, and I thought Dr. Tournier did a great job about talking about resiliency multiple times during lunch. But the way we're looking at that is really how do we diversify orbits? How do we proliferate? How do we disaggregate? Those are all ways that we get resiliency in our systems today. When we think about our historic systems, we didn't build resiliency in because we didn't have to, but we're now in a contested and congested environment, so it's got to be part of the baseline now. We need to be thinking about resiliency and building it immediately into the constellations we provide. He talked as well about laser comms, and we want to look at how do we optimize laser communications. When we think about RF, laser comms will give you an order of magnitude faster data rate, lower probability of intercept and detect, and it's more efficient to use, so it can be done on smaller satellites. So laser comms are definitely part of the SDA transport layer, an important part of our communication layers as we look to JADC2. We also want to consider the terrestrial layer and the magnitude and complexity of these systems that we're building for JADC2. We need to think about how our Wi-Fi connects when we walk from the coffee shop to our house to our workplace, right? We don't think about how those things happen. It's done automatically. That's done, to your point, with standards and open systems. So thinking about how we build those systems so that the warfighter isn't thinking about how I get this data, but what I'm going to do with the data that I've received, which is the power of JADC2. And a final thought would be on onboard processing. As we have these communication layers, there's going to be multiple sets of data coming through those, multiple origins of this data. what can we do on board of these systems and leverage artificial intelligence, shortening those timelines yet again for getting the information to the warfighter. So there's many, many things that we consider. Those are some of the ones that I would say would be key to consider.
Thanks, Maria. And you bring up a great point about either onboard or offboard processing. I would think transporting data and information at the speed of light with laser comms could enable quicker utilization of a ground-based system, but at the same time, there's still a latency issue with regard to targeting, et cetera, and handoffs that could certainly benefit from the onboard side of it. Would you agree? Yeah,
I do. And we've tried to take the word ground out of our lexicon and say, start to think about areas as nodes, and that, things don't have to go to the ground and come back. What can be done on board? The processing power now is so much improved from what it was 30 years ago, which is why we had to send things to the ground to be processed. But now the capability is on board to do it.
Great, thank you. General Grant, back to you. I confess, when I first heard the concept years ago about proliferated architectures to add resiliency, my younger days as a fighter pilot kicked in, and my readings from World War I, the fact that von Richthofen, most of his kills were against unarmed reconnaissance airplanes. And I thought, gee, in this environment, I could become an ace much sooner because there's so many more targets to shoot at. But I see it better now, I would say a little more clearly, that there's an opportunity here to flip the cost imposition equation. Today, if you have a multi-billion-dollar satellite that can be taken out by a single ASAT and destroy a capability that's critical to the warfighter, that's certainly an issue. But something else that was talked about before was the operational responsive space approach to resiliency, where as you were being attrited in these large constellations, that you would have the ability to rapidly reconstitute in a meaningful time during conflict. Is that something that's still being considered, or are we relying strictly on numbers here and planning that the attrition rates of those numbers will not be significant in the timeline that they're required to support the conflict?
Thanks. I would say yes. The short answer is yes. We are looking at that. And interestingly, and this is a conversation that I've been part of pretty recently, it really depends on who you ask, especially when you hear things like tactically responsive space. That kind of intimates at launch, but being ready to launch tomorrow is only part of the problem. You've got to have a payload that's already integrated. It has to have the acoustics, the environments. Frankly, it has to be sitting on the shelf or ready to plug into a bus, if that's going to be the model. A term of art, it's not mine, please don't attribute it to me, is a Civil Reserve Air Fleet for space, CRAF for space. What would that model look like? Does that mean that we have pre-negotiated access to commercial providers, that in a time of crisis, it's a matter of simply flipping a switch and turning on capability that we've already bought, so that we don't have to have that small lag of actually negotiating and getting on contract and using those capabilities? Or is it we've already incorporated those capabilities into our architecture, whether they're commercial or international allies and partners? The other advantage to that, and Maria kind of alluded to it, is that complicates the enemy's calculus. It puts a cost burden on them. One, they don't necessarily know what to target, and two, they have to choose to make that target. It could mean targeting a third party that isn't part of the fight. So in the sense of responsive space, it's the entire spectrum. It's launch, it's payloads ready to go, and it's on-orbit capabilities that are pre-negotiated, ready to go.
And that was what was always missing in the ConOps early on, was laying out the business model to do that, to actually have satellites in the barn, boosters ready to go. And we've moved forward quite rapidly, certainly in launch.
We have, and I'll give a plug to Lieutenant General Mike Gutlein out at the Space Systems Command in his commercial services office. It was born out of the commercial SATCOM, but it has grown to be true commercial services. And that is his front door to industry for those kinds of capabilities. And as Andrew Cox in the Space Warfighting Analysis Center builds out future force designs, those are the types of things we're considering to make sure that we're not single string, not reliant strictly on a DoD architecture.
Very good, thanks. And if I could follow up, this is a slightly different tangent, but I think quite often we think, space has to take care of space. And given the various threats that will hold our satellites at risk and hold them at risk today, you see a situation where terrestrially focused combat commands and services being in a supporting role to the U.S. Space Command and which would be the combatant command, obviously, where they would be supporting both the defense of survivability, the resilience of the current constellations with their terrestrial forces.
Thanks for that. It makes me smile because Lieutenant Grant was building systems that, you know, in the classic argument was is Space Command supporting or supported commander. And as my friends in the audience know, I'm an acquirer, so I'm going to give the DAU answer. And that's, it depends. So with this framework, you know, it would absolutely depend on national strategic and operational guidance. It would depend on phase of conflict and whether this is a first strike or a retaliatory strike. Having said that, I think it's perfectly reasonable to think there might be a time a combatant commander executes a terrestrial strike to protect and defend U.S. allied partner space assets.
And also in cyberspace, I would say, wouldn't you as well, to look at cyber opportunities to interdict their capabilities to hold our constellations at risk?
Yes.
Very good. Well, it's not a, I mean, to me, it's not a strange thing. The Air Force or the Army relies on the Air Force to provide close air support. So that would be the land component, relies on the air component. B-52s mine harbors for the naval component. We've been seeing all the different components support one another in an integrated fashion. And I don't know why space should be treated any differently in that regard, but there has to be a demand function from both the Space Force and an understanding between the services that the other services need to be prepared, which means they have to buy things that can do that to hold adversary assets at risk that threaten our space capabilities.
I agreed. And I believe General Thompson probably spoke to it briefly this morning. I'm not part of the combatant command. I'm part of the service, but I know for a fact that the combatant command under General Dickinson's leadership is absolutely cooperating with his other combatant commanders to ensure that integrated planning to make sure that those effects and capabilities are considered.
Great. Thanks very much. And I remind it's not without precedence. There is one time in history that I know of where space was the supported combatant command, and that was Operation Burnt Frost. And it worked out quite well. And we had tremendous support from about 16 different government agencies, all the services, to pull that off back in 2008. Brad, back to you. If we can switch the discussion back to space-based capabilities. I know the Air Force is looking at moving GMTI capabilities to space. And speaking of AMTI capabilities going to space eventually, there's obviously important nodes. These would be important nodes within the JADC2 construct as collectors and battle management assets. Can you speak to how you expect to see the tech progression and the important attributes that you think will be needed to compromise this capability that's advertised to be a global GMTI, a global AMTI capability?
Sure. Well, I'll make some comments on what one thinks could happen or should. And I'll use a historical analog as a way of getting at it. So if I go back and think about time, distance, sensing information, sensing and command and control information, I just go back and refer to something that happened in the 70s and 80s. We've been through this before. I was like, as a technologist, go back and think about history. Saltbreaker 1.0, the United States, as part of NATO with the Warsaw Pact, had to deal with second echelon Soviet forces in East Germany. I was a young officer serving on the board at the time. And there were a series of systems that were developed by the department at that time. AWACS came along similarly, but it was largely JSTARS and ATACMS, Lockheed Martin missile, long-range missile, and the Air Force operating a system. I think it was developed. My sister actually worked on it, Northrop Grumman. JSTARS, but the essence was long-range GMTI from an aircraft looking deep into the second echelon at that time, East Germany. So ATACMS could be targeted. Joint force capability, but it dealt with long range at the time, right? At that time, 100, 200 kilometers. Well, now in the Indo-PACOM AOR, we're thinking thousands of kilometers, not 1 or 200. We're thinking of seconds to minutes, not days and weeks, like the way the Soviet second echelon could move. But we're interested in the same sort of effects. We want to detect what's in the air. We want to detect what's on the ground to support the joint fight. And how do you do that? So one could conceivably think that instead of just keeping that in the air, we'll take that to space. Not going to make much more comment than that, but I think operationally, that's something really relevant that we should consider.
Very good. Thank
You
you.
know, I would add to that. I think
Please.
one of the most important things of that system is really the accessibility and the responsiveness to the warfighter. It has to be a system that's always on, always ready. It's always deployed.
Yep.
It has that advantage being from space, but that timeliness to the warfighter is, I think, a really key component as well.
And that kind of leads into data management, which I wanted to talk to you about a little bit, Maria. I mean, I don't know about you all, but every now and then I'll try to Google something and 20 pages will come up and I have to sort through and pick out the one that I really want. Someone in a cockpit doesn't have time to do that. And so there's got to be some kind of protocols where you can't be seeing everything all the time, but you have to be seeing things that are relative to your mission set, which could change day to day based on the frag order. And then also, if you could comment a bit on thinking about backwards compatibility. Your company has the F-22 and the F-35 out there. They're going to have to change anything in those airplanes to be able to ingest what we've been talking about here, the useful data that, and then synthesize it to the particular mission set the pilot is on that day to be effective. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think as you're talking about, it's really, that effective warfighting is really about integration, right? And taking the systems we have today, building the systems for tomorrow, and thinking about them as an integrated set, not individual platforms that no longer need to communicate with each other. We need to figure out, to your point, how to have the ones that we built yesterday talk to the ones that we built tomorrow. So I think it's really important for that integration. It needs to be seamless across the ecosystem, whether that's the satellites, the communications, or the platforms, the sensors that we're connecting to. That all needs to be seamlessly integrated. And I think there's some things to consider when you talk about that integration between space and sensors, the terrestrial, if you will, capabilities. First is the advantage we get by taking things like GMTI to space or other capabilities. Again, that high view, that ability to get into the access denied areas, the ability to cover vast ranges like you iterated in our introductions, right? Think about the area that we're going to be operating in. The second is around information dominance. And to your point, in the paper that came out this week on JADC2 from the Mitchell Institute, which again, there's a copy of outside, and it's an excellent paper, I think, that really highlighted 2 points about information that I thought were excellent. The first is that the data that's collected is as important or more important than the sensor that collects it. And we spend a lot of time talking about our sensors. It's really about that data at that last mile that gets to the user that makes the decision. So that is a key and important note. The second is that not all data needs to go to all nodes. And I think that's a really important concept to understand. I only need the right message at the right time to the right sensor or effector to get the result that I want. I don't need to know everything that your system knows. I just need you to talk to me in a way that I can understand, which gets us to the interoperability of open standards, open systems architectures, and standards. And if we use that, and Derek talked a little bit about those translator capabilities, that's how we can connect existing systems with future systems by kind of making those connections. A lot of that's done in software. So we can do this fairly rapidly. A lot of times it's the stovepipes between government, pillars that don't enable that. It's not that we technically can't do the things that we're talking about doing. And I would just add, General Kreider has this great analogy. She used to talk about this being like a bicycle and that you're walking next to the bicycle, pushing it, right? And integrating these is really getting on that bicycle and pedaling and getting that whole JADC2 capability at one time.
Excuse me. Thank you. I'd like to stay on the big data, drowning in data, if you will, opportunity here, just for the entire panel. Brad, I'll go to you first. Thoughts on that? I mean, will there be protocols? If I jump in my F-35 and I know I'm going to go out into this area, either for a specific target or a general area to hold adversary assets at risks, and I drop in my data transfer module, whatever we're using today to go do that, is that going to then set up a query system to this source of data, global data, that makes sure I get what I need for specifically what I'm doing, and I'm not watching what's going on over South America while I'm operating in the Western Pacific? Your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think in the last 10 or 15 years, talking with General Deptula yesterday and this morning about this, in the last 10 or 15 years, the explosion in processing, and I'll call out a specific element, the GPU, the graphical processing unit, which really came about because of gaming. It's just the way where it came from. But the explosion processing capability per pound that you can put on the ground, in the air, or in space has completely changed architectures. And so the point is within a JADC2 framework, where I put the processing nodes can be optimized for the sensing, the effect you're after, where the human's involved. You still gonna have to deal with the whole issue of release authority and where accountability is. But in terms of the technical trades of where you can put that processing chain, that's been radically opened up by the availability of the GPU. And frankly, if you've lived anywhere in the Fairfax County, Northern Virginia area, and you've seen the cloud centers explode, that has all come about because of the GPU element. And I think, so now you can start thinking about, I don't need to carry all the data. I don't need to download racks and racks and terabytes of hard drives on a predator in my land to offload all the data. I can distribute that. Also means that the amount of data on my data links or my network system can be optimized based on where the effect needs to be, or where the command and control decision needs to be, or where the weapons release authority has to be. And that was something we didn't have that ability 10 or 15 years ago. But that's what I think about certain technical nuggets that have completely changed the architectures. That's one that sticks out in my mind is the GPU.
Great, thanks, Brad. John Grant, any thoughts on
Two data, two thoughts. One, amplifying something that Maria said. So my friend Greg Gagnon, Major General Greg Gagnon, the S2, has a phrase. He says that the right data analyzed is much more important than more data. So we have to help the analysts with that. And really, as the calculus of conflict compresses in time, the human on the loop needs technology to help aid and make smart decisions, whether it's code development, target pairing. A human in the loop probably won't be able to prosecute the future war in the timelines that we need. So it absolutely has to be aided by technology.
Great. Maria, anything else you'd like to add?
I totally agree. And from an industry perspective, the way we get there is through artificial intelligence. I mean, that's absolutely how we get through the amount of data that you have to process and get those nuggets to the human that will make the final decision. We're doing that today in a lot of areas. We're delivering AI in areas where it enables an analyst to not have to look at all the data, but pare it down to the key pieces of data for the human to look at. We need to be doing that more. Anywhere where there's data where it's not as critical, say logistics or things that are repetitive, where there's large data sets we can train on, we should be moving that to AI now and building the trust so that someday when we are in the very fast and rapid actions that we're going to need to take, we will have built trust in these AI systems to know the outcomes that we can expect them to have.
Very good. Brad, did you have a follow-up?
Well, I was just going to say,
thanks,
to get it, a human on the loop versus in the loop, what Maria was talking about with speed. I'll give you an analogy. A 5th gen platform, without getting into any specific details, the 5th gen platform is capable of electromagnetic battle against an adversary. That battle is going to happen so quickly in nanosecond time frame. In humans, it's hands off, right? You can't respond quick enough to defeat a threat from an electronic attack scenario if you're in the loop. You got to be on the loop, got to be monitoring it. But we're getting to the point now where these things happen so quickly. They're not hours and days, they're minutes and seconds.
Milliseconds.
And we build
Milliseconds.
trust by using those AI systems now on more simple or less risky areas to make decisions right now.
Absolutely.
Build that trust so that when these larger systems are deployed in the future, we're ready.
Let me shift to a common complaint you'll hear from warfighters as technology allows their people further up the command and control chain to know what's going on. You know, there's a difference between tactical level command and control, operational level, and strategic. One of the complaints in the South Asian conflicts, particularly with UAVs, was that the operators felt that occasionally there was a 2,000-mile long screwdriver adjusting them, telling them what to do beyond the orders that they were given for the particular mission set that they were on. And as we can imagine, everybody knowing everything, at some point this temptation will grow. Is there a technical solution to this, or is it best just left to the maturity of the command elements to know when to engage and when not to engage, when to give general orders, as General Dempsey advocated for? What was his term for that? I recall mission type orders, mission command orders, and turn the ingenuity, innovativeness of the warfighter at the leading edge loose versus the adversary by tight control from above. Any thoughts on, is that in the technical solution set or not?
I think it would be easy to achieve, but the computers only do what we tell it to do. So if we tell it not to give all the data, it won't. I think it goes back to that very important talk about not every node needs to know what every other node is doing. It's just that key. You really need to identify what is the data that you want to receive or that you want sent or broadcasted, if you will. And those are the items that we would want to do, not every node providing every bit of data that it has, because then you will get overwhelmed and it doesn't meet any needs.
Yeah, Brett?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think this is a military issue to allow commanders and units to operate the way they should operate. Just because you have the information doesn't mean you'll use it. I mean, the example I was given was thinking about is, Afghanistan, we had second lieutenants, first lieutenants, and sergeants acting as mayors and village in Afghanistan. They were never trained for that. But these are just good young people that are doing what they're trained to do. So I mean, maybe we can exercise that level of influence. The question is, maybe the commanders just need to take their hands off and let their people do the mission they gave them to operate.
Phil, is this something that are even been thought about now, or is that far down the road?
I would add that we have to architect the systems to enable this, because there might be a time that the tactical units don't have comms. So the true essence of decentralized execution is they know their job, and for whatever reason, they're not hearing from upper echelons. To Brad Murray's point, the architecture of the C2 system can enable that if we choose to do so.
Okay, a decision to be made in the future.
I think so.
Okay, very good. One last question for you. We've discussed and we've heard some of the challenges of costs associated with this sort of capability. And the hope is, as Dr. Tournay said, that it's going to be close to a wash and well worth the investment for the proliferated global aspects of both the comms layer and the sensor layer and other layers that will go up. But there's the other side of the coin. What's the cost of not securing a focused set of space-based JADC2 capabilities? How can you envision operating or providing technology that would solve some of these issues with the vastness of the Western Pacific? And Maria, I'll start with you.
I mean, from a warfighter perspective, my panelists would be better suited to answer that. But from a technical perspective, it's kind of like saying I'd rather still have my Garmin, my phone, my flip phone, and my camera, not have it all on an iPhone, which makes a lot of sense, right? So I think if we want that power, technically, it's very possible to do these things. We have shown some of it already, and the capability is there for us from a technical perspective to provide it. And I think there's a lot of reasons to do that.
Great. Brad?
I was going to say that, and this gets to one of Derek's main points, why he's able to implement the architecture he's working on. And it gets back to rocket engines, the WA-11 engines. The rocket equation is one of the immutable facts of life. But what's happened in the last 25 years is that a variety of innovators in the United States have attacked the manufacturing engineering of the rocket. LOX RP, for example, LOX methane, or as compared to LOX hydrogen, which is high performance. But they've attacked that problem and they've driven the cost of launch down. You can evaluate different ways. The last 20 years, somewhere between 10 and 100 reduction in the cost per pound per kilogram of launch. That's changing all these architectures, changing everybody's assumption. That changes venture capitalists thinking I'm going to put money into space because I can get a return on investment, which is leverage at the department and the Air Force, Space Force, and leverage. But to Maria's point, that also means within Derek's architecture, I can put a periphery architecture and maybe some amount of it, I'm going to provide dedicated special resilience, and that's going to be affordable as well. And so I keep coming back to thinking what's fundamentally changed that's opened all this up. It's the cost of launch has gone down. And in the next 2 or 3 years, when Americans start realizing we're sending hundreds of tons to orbit on one launch, you're starting to move just infrastructure off the planet. And so when the costs go down that much, it allows you to change all these architectures, how you think about it. And a piece of that's going to be resilience. I think you're going to have a mix of both.
Great, thanks. John Grant, last word on this one.
So I'd say if we don't get JADC2 right, the combatant commanders, our allies and partners, lose situational awareness, and ultimately the battle management means to win. So that's the cost. We don't win.
Pretty straightforward. Thanks very much. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we'll open up the floor for questions for the panel, please. I mean, just again, a reminder to state your name and any organization you represent, and bring you a microphone when you put your hand up. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Kurt Heckmer. Thank you very much for the comments and the perspective. To me, it sounds a little philosophical. And my question is an acquisition, former Air Force, what's the PE and what's the FIDAP? And until you have those answers, you really are having a lot of industry sitting around waiting for that information. because we won't invest and we won't move forward to meet your requirements. So what is the PE and what's the FIDAP?
Sure, I won't sit here and try to quote PEs. I will tell you that we do have various programs attacking each of these areas. You heard about Dr. Tournier's, you heard about Space Systems Command, not so much about the Space RCO and some of the other partners. As the Space Force's Chief Resourcing Officer, and given what is public for the 23 budget on the Hill, the nation has seen an inflection in the importance of space and investment in space. And I can tell you that when the 24 budget is public, you'll see that trend also increasing. Your comment about philosophical, I would disagree with that. These are real programs. Dr. Tournier is absolutely right. We are committed to this architecture, and there are investments being executed today to deliver the sensors and the various orbital regime architectures. So perhaps from a JADC2 perspective, I would say aspirational at this point that all of those services, truly the J and the joint all domain command and control, that's the work to come. But from a Space Force enabling perspective, I would say these are very real, well-funded, and incredibly well-supported in the building and on the Hill.
Other questions? Stunned silence. I guess maybe one of the issues is if you're a small company out there and you want to compete in this, how do you know that there's a call for what you might be putting out there? I mean, the classic PE and the formal programs in the past, BAAs, et cetera, you know, the word got out. Is there anything changing there to make sure that everybody knows the needs in these other contracting forms that are going out there, whether the OTAs or whatever?
Sure. And sir, I'll give you the same answer I told General Thompson. I said, sir, I am not a program manager.
You are the hated.
I am very careful to stay in my swim lane, despite that's what I grew up doing. So what I'll do is I'll put a plug out for some of my friends. One of the most novel things that the acquisition community has been doing are what they call reverse industry days, where a traditional industry day like happened in LA last week, I think it was. And I was looking at my date because I was in Corona last week for my very first Corona, and I know we sent some folks out to Industry Day, and that's where the acquisition centers are going to talk about their requirements and their needs, very traditional. But this idea of a reverse Industry Day is industry, particularly focused on smaller, non-traditional partners, will come to the service and kind of pitch their ideas, almost like a Shark Tank approach from the TV show. And it sparks an idea and maybe something that the program office hasn't thought of. And maybe there's a partnership with a larger prime because they've got the force of size to help one of these smaller companies kind of marry up and provide a capability. I will say, like you mentioned, a lot of the other traditional activities. Plus, as Dr. Tournier mentioned, his battle rhythm is much shorter and faster. So as these companies are engaging and competing, it's not like, oh, I have to wait 10 years for that next increment, as he talked about. So it's almost a nonstop acquisition cycle. And I'll be frank, again, not a program manager right now, but that's a challenge. That's a burden on the organization to keep that tempo and do the work at the same time as executing it. You know, in the legacy days, and my friend Mark Baird is in the audience somewhere. He and I were in launch together. We were very deliberate to actually plan our act strategy to prevent that. So I would say that's an area where we're taking good risk to make sure we're going fast and constantly providing opportunities to the industry.
Very good. Thank you. Other questions? Oh, we have one over here.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Diane Ashley with Deloitte. Joe Grant, I was at SSC Industry Days last week, so lots of good discussion. Not exactly how you described it, but lots of good interchange, great leadership. What's helpful to us is having those dialogue and that discussion. One of the panels I thought that was really interesting, they called themselves the old timers. They called themselves that, so I'm allowed to say it. And General Graves was on the panel, and Doug Rivera, and Joel Tatini, and Joel Taverny. And General Grease was commenting about shoe leather and the importance of socializing your ideas and your thoughts regularly, often with staffers and all the stakeholders. When it comes to JADC2, I feel like that's such an important step. And I wonder if you all would comment on the shoe leather aspect of it.
I would use the example of General Cropsey again. His shoe leather and his frequent flyer mile. His shoe leather is wearing out and his frequent flyer miles are soaring. He is absolutely getting out on the street, talking to the stakeholders, whether they're government, industry, joint force, to meet the players, understand the issues, and do the missionary work for the advocacy.
There's a piece of that for industry. as
Yeah, I
well.
was gonna say,
no,
exactly, and I was gonna comment on that, but in reverse, I think we're obligated to bring to our customers solutions and opportunities where we see, because we own many of the platforms and systems that we're talking about, we can bring to them the opportunities that we see to enable the JADC2 more quickly. So it goes both ways for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I was just going to say it's both sides. I think an element of some of this was lost during COVID, frankly, and I think we're all getting spun up, kind of getting back into gear with the clutch, so to speak. But yeah, absolutely, we've all got to hit the street within the consortium. Working on. I know we're spending a lot of time with the Air Force now, and with Titan, we spend a lot of time with the Army now. But on top of that, we've got to keep socializing and talking about it. Very good.
We also have the ability to scan industry and see what's out there that's commercial that we can bring in. And I know as larger primes, we do that frequently. So, where there's capability, we were talking about gaming earlier, right?
Yeah.
Those are things that we've brought in and they're now part of our portfolio in many ways. So, we have that ability to be looking for those technologies that we know would enable our customers as well.
Yeah, it's a big part of it is just education, right, of all stakeholders. I think the life cycle of an acronym. First, you come up with a cute acronym, then you have to explain to everybody what the letters stand for. And then you have to explain to them what it actually is, what it is you're talking about. I would argue that's kind of where we are in the JADC2 acronym. The backside of that is everybody forgets what it stood for, but they know what it is. And so it's a really important time period to be explaining to the Congress that owns the purse strings, to the other customers of this concept of exactly what the vision is, what's going to be brought to bear, and how it's going to work. And without that advocacy and understanding, the dollars just won't flow to support it, I would argue. Would you agree?
Yes.
Okay. Great. I love it when people agree with me. Any other questions? Over here.
Yeah, hi, I'm Brown, Scientific Systems. Anybody who wants to answer it, what do you think is the key technical enabler, if there is one, to make JADC2 a reality? And let's say non-network technology.
Oh, and you said non-network?
Yeah, everybody talks about the network.
Got it. So I think from the standpoint of there's going to be a piece of it's going to be standards. Unfortunately, it's going to come back to networks. It's going to be standards, because if you don't have it in place, then the ability to distribute the processing and figure out what are the applications within an application layer framework. If you don't get that at the start, you're going to be spinning your wheels a lot. So I think that's going to, and that's fundamentally systems engineering, which is one of the pieces that we're involved with right now within the ABMS Digital Infrastructure Consortium, is getting that system engineering down up front, so you have an open layer. Another example of that we're working right now for the U.S. Space Force is the Forge framework, right? It's something we're working from an infrared standpoint for capabilities, and a big piece of what we're focused on up front is system engineering to allow an open architecture framework so you can grow that in time within an agile or a tranche approach, so to speak.
I'm a system engineer, so you just spoke to my heart. So I totally agree with everything you just said. It's the standards, the open systems architectures, because that enables everyone, to your point. Anyone can play as long as they know what the interface is to code to or build to. I also think artificial intelligence is just a key component of this, and we really need to be leaning into it. The Chinese are leading into it. We need to be leaning into it very hard, and we need to be getting to quantum, frankly. That's what we really should be talking about. So there's a lot to do from a technical perspective and to build trust in that as well.
Right. John Grant, anything you'd like to add?
I can't add to that. That was perfect.
Great, great. No one said that about me yet today. Any other questions? Any from over here? Dark. All right. Over here on the far right from the audience perspective. And I think this will be our time for one last question.
Hi, Frank Purdy. I just want to ask the panel, particularly industry, how do you vet technologies? How do you reach into the commercial environment and identify technologies that can solve problems today versus developing it in-house? And it costs quite a bit of money. So fundamentally, if you look at the way data is distributed in the commercial market space, Google, Amazon, and all of them have invested heavily in that. Excuse me. Are we looking at the way they do business and trying to bring that into what we do?
Sure. Thanks, Frank.
Is he from your company?
No. No, I think first and foremost, there has to be a culture. There has to be a culture of the people that are in your organization that are willing to look outside the traditional defense ecosystem. It's a mindset. It's a mindset. Once you identify, and then this comes back to Derek's point, once you identify that the commercial world's going to spend 10 times as much as you are on, I'll call it relational technology, not specifically the end item, but relational technology or applicability to you. If you don't have a culture of your people that are willing to look outside their existing ecosystem and understanding, that it's hopeless. And I think that's the point. It's a mindset. And because there's plenty of technology out there, you probably don't have enough time in the day. But I think that's the fundamental point: is you got to have a culture of the people that are willing to do it. And I think it's going to take time. I think it's happening, but it will take time.
Yeah, I think we're similar in that sense. A lot of it for us happens through our R&D organization and our corporate organization, where we're looking at companies and looking at technologies to invest in. Conferences, there's just all kinds of ways. We similarly hold events similar to the Shark Tank idea that you talked about, where they can come and present their technologies to us for consideration. So it's just a multitude of ways, but it's something that's constantly active to do that.
I think you're also seeing the government being willing to take more risk and trying these newer technologies, even if they're at lower TRLs. So it is a change in acceptance.
Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time period for this panel. Maria, Brad, General Grant, thank you so much for participating. About a round of applause for our panel members.